Today, my guest and I discuss narrative design in games.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, before we jump into today's interview, which is outstanding, by the way, I would like your help just a little bit. If you could like, rate, review, or subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening to it, that would greatly, greatly please me. All right. Those things could take you just a second just to press like a little button or something like that. Those things help the show immensely, and I would greatly appreciate it, okay, guys, because I could use the help. I want as many people to find this show as possible so we can all share in the great hobby of tabletop role-playing games. And if you don't know who I am by now, please check out my website, DiceGeeks.com, where you will find random tables, dungeon maps, character sheets, collections of SRDs for multiple tabletop RPGs. You will find all kinds of stuff, in addition to more than 100 of these podcast episodes that you can listen to and glean gaming wisdom from. All right, well, here is today's interview. My guest today is a narrative designer, Nick Jones. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on today. And now I'll have you explain narrative designer here in a little bit, but you are fascinated with games and stories. How did kind of all of that begin for you? When did you realize that you needed to tell stories?
Yeah, it's a good question, and probably one that I don't have a specific answer for. It's sort of been something that has always been a part of my life. You know, I'm based here in New Zealand, and I was raised by a published poet and sort of encouraged to tell stories from a pretty young age. So I believe the first story I ever wrote was about 2 sentences long, and I would have been about 4 years old. So you could bring it all the way back to there. But really, I guess the game side of thing came into it in my early 20s. Really, I had gone to university to study creative writing to be an English teacher, and sort of through that process started realizing that I was writing a lot about game narrative in my theses and things like that, and yeah, so that sort of got me thinking, and I kind of muddled around for a bit trying to find the right people to talk to, but eventually sort of bumped into someone who knew someone, and then landed my first job in game design, or game narrative design, I should say.
Maybe just also, if you could explain to us, so you work mainly with video games. What does narrative designer mean? Isn't that just a writer, or is it something different than that?
Yeah, so there is a little bit of confusion, I guess, floating around about that, because you know for so long it was just game writer. You know, you were the game writer. You came in usually near the end of the project, and it was your job to kind of stitch everything together and form a cohesive narrative out of it. But narrative design, which is a fairly new term, I believe 10 years or so it's been around, but it's more of a I guess like a high level look at narrative. I tend to try and simplify narrative design down to basically it's about looking at the story and seeing how that can reflect the gameplay, and vice versa. So sort of creating this marriage between the two, whereas something like game writing is more purely focused on just the dialogue and the bits and pieces that players read or listen to as they play through a game.
Yeah, and I imagine, as video games become more and more complex, then that obviously opens up the need for somebody to kind of manage all of those pieces, right?
Yeah. There's often a lot of information that you have to sort of digest and be able to pull from at any given time. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and of course, the main focus of my show is on tabletop RPGs. But I reached out to you because I think it's just important for game masters or dungeon masters as we're playing role playing games. To understand how we can tell stories, with our friends, and how we can tell those stories better and better each time that we run games for our friends. And of course, I know a lot of my audience is into video games as well, so I'm sure this will be, doubly interesting for people. So maybe I'll take like before we dive in kind of into some specifics of your work, maybe kind of high level, when you are looking at a video game, what are some elements that you that tell you kind of like this is a good story? Like, what are some elements that you like to see that kind of just say, oh yeah, this is good?
Yeah, I guess there's the usual sort of things that you look for in any good story, right? Strong characters, drama, conflict, sort of that emotional resonance that comes from a good story, whether it's a tabletop game, a video game, movie, TV, whatever. I guess in terms of the uniqueness of the game genre, I would also be looking for, like I said, things that sort of story that mirrors the gameplay, right? So there's a narrative purpose for leveling up. It's not just a bunch of numbers that are chucked at you every time you reach a new sort of stage in the game. There is a story reason for that. Things like that are things that I tend to look for. Environmental storytelling as well. So how does the level of or the area that I'm playing in, how does that tell me about the history of the world? What is that old battlefield over there? What coat of arms are the skeleton soldiers wearing, and what does that mean to the history of the world? That sort of thing.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. And just to kind of follow up, I think that is some kind of tension, like you were just saying there, between giving a story reason for some kind of game mechanic, I guess, for lack of a better word, right? Because when a lot of people are playing Dungeons and Dragons, you say, you'll hear people say, well, how realistic is it that you just gained, 5 new spells, or that you just became stronger instantly when you level up, or something like that? And of course, that happens in video games as well. Maybe could you give us an example of like, how would you try to integrate leveling up into a story to make it feel a little bit more satisfying than just to be like, well, kind of break the fiction and say, oh, well, it's a game, right? And you need to be stronger for the next level or something like that.
Yeah, I think with that example in particular, there's a really good game series. I'm sure you've heard of it, and a lot of your listeners would have as well. The BioShock franchise, right?
Mm-hmm.
BioShock has it's not like a full RPG leveling up system, but they do have some sort of basic RPG elements in there. Particularly with leveling up in the BioShock games, it's done through injecting yourself with these special can I say drugs?
Sure.
I'm not sure what other term to give it, but these drugs that sort of fireballs or do whatever, right? And so there is a narrative reason at that point for these new powers that the character gathers as they go through the game, right? And that is that these drugs have been fabricated by Rapture, by the people the scientists that were all working away down under the ocean there. So that, I guess that's a good entry level example on how you would do something like that.
No, absolutely. That is maybe serum doesn't have the negative connotation of the word drug or something.
Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah, no. And so, no, I think that is a great, I think that is a great example because, it does come up every once in a while when you hear, oh, we just got stronger in the middle of combat or something. Well, there can be a story reason for that. And I think it does really just, I think it does really push you creatively, doesn't it? That when you try to think of those things, because you have the mechanic for a reason, right? To really engage people in the game and keep them kind of coming back and working with their character. But it really pushes you creatively then to tie it to some kind of, to the narrative in some way, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I think that the end goal of any kind of storytelling is to create emotional resonance in the audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's always a difficult end goal to try and reach anyway. But particularly with narrative design, we're trying to foster what's called Ludo narrative cohesion, right? People probably might have heard the term Ludo narrative dissonance floated around before if they've sort of explored storytelling in the game's context, and that is when the gameplay and the narrative are in conflict with each other, right? So something like the new Wolfenstein games, which are great games that I love. I've played through them multiple times, but you've got this contrast between the narrative where your protagonist is sort of monologuing a lot about how evil war is and how it just only destroys. And then at the same time, the gameplay is encouraging you to kill Nazis in increasingly violent and over the top ways, right? And I'm all for killing Nazis, but there is a divergence there between the gameplay and the storytelling, which at times can put a barrier between the player and the experience. So not only are we trying to create emotional resonance, but we're also trying to sort of do the opposite of that and bring these two things together.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, and I do find that interesting because you do see that kind of dissonance appear, probably more often, than not sometimes, right? Because there is kind of this simple appeal to the game, but somebody was trying to put something else into it and it just didn't work exactly, right?
Yeah, and working in games, you're working with a team of people, right? So it's a collaborative effort, and I'm sure you know from running tabletop games. Sometimes people just don't want to collaborate, and and so there's that level as well where you are trying to, as a narrative designer, champion the story and champion this idea of these two things coming together in partnership, and just sometimes it doesn't get through for whatever reason, or people decide to go a different route, and that's okay. But the end goal, the ideal is always to sort of try and hit that target.
Yeah. And I know all too well that there are some people who just don't want to collaborate. Usually I have very low consequences because it's just a group of friends or something, but it still can be frustrating sometimes. But no, that is an interesting point, and I think that is something that we can that role players and game masters, and when we're running games, that we can maybe communicate that, or through clues, either directly or through clues, kind of communicate kind of what kind of game we're playing. So kind of everybody knows that everybody's kind of on the same page when we're running through this scenario and that. I just find all of this interesting. You also mentioned that you can kind of enhance the story through environmental ways, and you started giving a little example there. I know just from running tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and other ones, that sometimes the environment gets forgotten because I have so many other things I'm thinking about. I'm managing health on, 15 enemies or something. And thinking about NPCs and different things. And I'll forget a lot of the element details because that's kind of one of the first things that goes because I don't know, it's just because there is a lot to handle. So I've been really trying to work on bringing in environmental details. So, you kind of started with a little example there, maybe could you kind of break that out a little bit? And it's like, how would you use the environment to reinforce story?
Yeah. So, a really good example of this sort of storytelling, can be found in From Software's games, so Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, those games, which are infamously difficult, but if you can sort of move past that stage, there's like really complex world building being done and being told through the environment. I think that environmental storytelling is a really interesting approach because it's unique to interactive mediums.
Mm-hmm.
It relies on like a collaboration with the player or the audience member, as it may be in the case of immersive theatre, for example. And it relies on this back and forth exchange, and so there's a very rewarding experience that comes from being a player, exploring an area, and being able to sort of pick out little things about the history of the world or what went on in that place before they arrived, right? Mm-hmm. With my work, when I'm sort of engaging with this environmental storytelling process, one of the first things that I try to do when I sort of come on board with the team is start developing an expansive story Bible. And a story Bible is important for multiple reasons, but primarily world building, right? You sort of are establishing the rules of the world in this one document that everyone can sort of draw from as they're building the game. And having this document there allows you to imbue elements of the world with history, right? So a level is not just a level is a location that has potentially hundreds, maybe even thousands of years of history. And so we want to see how those events have worn down that environment over time. So I used the example before of the sort of the battlefield, right? And this idea that you could come across a battlefield and see, a ruined statue and some skeletons of dead soldiers, and one group of the soldiers have shields with a family crest on them, and the other have a different family crest, right? And so you can then draw from that situation. Okay, this family went to war with this family. The crumbled statue there might be a statue of like the king of one area or the leader of that family, and it's sort of been pulled down. And so you can infer from that environmental setup a whole backstory of this battle that took place. And so that is made infinitely easier by having a story Bible with all these events in it that you can be like, okay, this happened in this area, so let's display this in the world as we're developing it.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great example. And like I said, sometimes I struggle with that when I'm running my games because I have so many other kind of decisions I'm making. But I think that is really great. And I think I'm always kind of drawn to an example in literature or maybe even cinema now but from the Lord of the Rings, right? Edoras, the Hall of Rohan, is made of wood. The hall in Minas Tirith is made completely of stone, right? And that just seems like a simple difference, but like it totally tells you the difference between those two cultures, like almost instantly. And just even a small detail like that, I think can go a long way when you're telling a story.
Yeah, absolutely. Architecture is always a big part of it. So when you're sort of working as a narrative designer and trying to convey these environmental stories, it becomes very much even more so a collaborative effort. You have to sort of be back and forth with the art director and the level designers and whoever, sometimes even the people in charge of the sound effects, there might be a particular song that is local to a small village or something, and so when you walk through that village, there'll be people playing that song, and perhaps that song relates to a folk story or a myth or whatever, and you can sort of just keep going back and back and back, further and further, and building on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those little details like that just add richness to the world, and those different layers. I think that's usually kind of the key, is just having different layers, or that's usually what I do when I try to tell stories, is to add some layers onto some things so it seems a little bit more real, because it seems like there was always a civilization before, right? There was always something before. And it just seems like that's always the case. So of course there would be something that came before the present. And
and I mean, we know from archaeology and everything that societies sort of build on top of each other. So there's you can kind of do an excavation of the world through this kind of storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, I kind of mentioned earlier, of course, video games are becoming more and more complex. The stories are becoming more and more immersive. I am sadly, in certain respects, old enough to remember very simple video games that had no stories, or the world's being invaded by aliens, and that was the story. And then you just have to shoot them all, like Space Invaders or something. But or you eat the dots and don't get hit by ghosts from Pac-Man or whatever. As the technology is expanding, as we're getting more and more opportunities to tell stories in different ways and to make them more immersive. And I was going to ask you, just share an example really quick, and then ask you if you think this is kind of where storytelling is going, or games are going. Because a few years ago, I ran a session for it was a science fiction RPG called Stars Without Numbers. I ran it for a few friends, and it was the first time I had played, and it was the first time they had played, and we just ran the session, and we had a really great session, and we kind of had to end it. And I knew I wasn't really probably going to play with these people again, for a while, if ever, at least a couple of them, because they were kind of visiting. And the next day, on our text thread about scheduling the game, I texted out just like 2 sentences of kind of aftermath of what happened in the session. And I got some really good positive feedback, because, and I didn't really realize what I was doing at the time. I was continuing the game in another format on text, after we had met in person and played a game a few years ago. And just that next day, sending that text kind of continued the game and increased the enjoyment of myself and my players. And I was just wondering, are video games kind of heading that way? Are we going to kind of keep the story going in other platforms when we're not sitting in front of a computer screen or a console?
Yeah, no, I definitely believe that. I have worked a lot in transmedia storytelling as well, and that's very much about that and sort of spreading the narrative across different platforms so that it can be accessed in multiple different ways. And each platform has its own unique benefits and unique drawbacks, I guess. I think that we're moving into like this sort of age of experience when it comes to any form of media, really. You see now Netflix is starting to do a game subscription system. So there's a move across the board towards transmediated storytelling and this kind of collaborative back and forth exchange between the audience and the storyteller. I like to sort of say that we're no longer the author is no longer important, right? It's kind of like this whole death of the author situation. What is important now is this back and forth conversation between the audience and the writer or the storyteller, so that the audience feels like they are co-writing alongside you, and that is done primarily through having transmediated content and interactive content, and sort of this idea that we as creators listen to the audience or to the players, and try to sort of incorporate back into what we're doing their thoughts and ideas, so that they feel like they are being included in the creation of the narrative.
Yeah. And of course, video games are, well, I guess very rarely now almost just static things, right? There's always updates to them, right? Or MMOs that are just kind of continuing on, and you can take that feedback then from players, right, and add that right into the narratives of the game. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. It's all about listening, and understanding where players are coming from and what they like and what they don't like. Because you've got to understand, we're living in this sort of time where we've got pervasive digital communication, the internet, and so like every person that is online, they have multiple different social accounts, and they will put on a different version of themselves depending on what social account they're using, right? And what that means is that they can then push their thoughts and their opinions out to multiple groups of people, potentially thousands of people. And so audiences, for the first time ever, have this ability to kill an idea in its tracks or, grow it. So it's very important that as creators, we're listening to our audiences and what they like, what they don't like, and then trying to, incorporate their interests into whatever project we're working on in unique and surprising ways, so that they, simultaneously feel like they are being listened to, but at the same time they are being surprised by the content.
Yeah. And of course, we're on the kind of this, I guess, this bleeding edge of this technology, right? I mean, we're all already coming into seeing, kind of virtual reality that actually works, and instead of kind of the abortive attempt kind of in the 1990s and things that we're kind of seeing some of these things. So I'm just finding it interesting that that kind of the idea that the game can continue on different platforms or receive feedback, from different platforms. And of course, I mean, there are now people who make their living playing video games with people watching them play, right? And so we're getting layers and layers of people enjoying games, right? Them playing it themselves and watching somebody else play, talking about it, say on a different platform like Twitter or Facebook or something. They're getting enjoyment out of it in variety of different ways, and they're experiencing that story, I guess, in a sense, through somebody else's eyes while they're watching it and wondering what choices they will make, even though they may have played that same game, 5-10 times or something like that.
Yeah. And I think what we're going to see is less so the creation of individual titles and more so the creation of worlds, because a world you can move onto whatever platform, right? And that also allows for these different layers of different levels of interaction, like you mentioned, the Let's Play videos and the Twitch streaming, all that sort of stuff can be incorporated into a world being built rather than just an individual game or title. it allows for that collaborative back and forth and exploring onboarding and offboarding of IP in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just really quick before we move on to how you have been incorporating folklore into your work. I did notice, on some platforms, say like EVE Online, right? Even logging into the video game is gamified, right? If you log in for 2 weeks, every day for 2 weeks, you're going to get special gear. And it just seems like everything is being gamified, right? That it's all being, tied in some way to that, like, you do this and you get rewards for it. I just find some of that kind of interesting, and I don't know if I've processed all of that, if I like some of it actually, or if I don't. But I just find it fascinating that almost everything is gamified within the game, even little things that, like, little awards on Xbox when you reach certain achievements. Those are all gamified even within the larger game. And
I mean, I have a close friend who's a immersive theater producer, and they did a couple of years back a show called Pleasure Dome, which was sort of a 1980s sort of grungy New York City vibe, about like a nightclub, and their sort of approach was that the story starts as you purchase the ticket. And so there was a whole narrative that came with the purchasing of the ticket. When you arrived and, had your ticket clipped, you walk through like a subway tunnel that had been done up. So it was like you were sort of coming out of the New York subway station, rather than just, walking into a building and sitting down in your seat or whatever. There was this experiential entry point into the show. In fact, if I recall correctly, they'd actually set up an entire fake 1980s New York street that you come out of the subway station into and can kind of wander around there just while the show is getting ready to start. So there's a lot of really cool creative ideas happening in various interactive fields around how we can start the story even sooner, and hook people even faster.
Yeah. Like I said, I find that just fascinating. But I did tease a little bit. You have really started incorporating folklore into your game design, and you've kind of created a model, and I'll ask you to kind of describe that in a bit. But why, just to start off kind of basically, why do you think folklore is a kind of a good kind of a piece for us to have in our toolkit as storytellers?
Well, look, folklore is, first off, one of the oldest forms of storytelling, if not the oldest, right? And if you sort of look at the way folk stories were told and sort of shared, hundreds, thousands of years ago, there is this interactive nature that to it that mirrors interactive storytelling today, right? The storyteller of a folktale was typically a priest or a shaman or something like that, and they would gather around a fire and they would tell this story to their people, and there would be this back and forth in which people could sort of interject and toss their own ideas into the mix, if you will. And so that was a fascinating concept to me, and sort of seeing the parallel between that and what we're doing today with video games and other interactive forms of media. It got me thinking that maybe there was something in there that could be explored to sort of further enhance both immersion, but also like that sense of that the player gets that they are that they have some form of ownership of the story. There is that personal connection, and so that was really where I started off as I sort of started exploring this field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so is your idea then that we would base the story on on the folktale, or that we just take ideas and kind of concepts from the folklore?
I mean, there's definitely an element of adaptation that's available to us. I'm actually adapting some folklore at the moment into a little project with some friends, but my focus has primarily been on looking at what are the archetypes and themes and different ideas that are explored over and over again in folklore across different cultures. And what do they mean in terms of the sort of underlying engine that drives the story, and sort of pulling those out and then sort of adapting them to the interactive game medium.
Yeah. And I mean, when I run a lot of role-playing games, and that I like to draw kind of concepts and ideas from just, movies I've seen and books that I've read. And I'm just kind of wondering if that's the same kind of idea. Like, we're just taking, like you said, some of these archetypes, and then, that would probably be familiar in some way to our players or our audience, but then weaving them kind of in a different way, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, some of the archetypes that I am drawing from are things that would possibly not be so commonly known about today. But in general, it's about sort of looking at the root of this archetype and what does this archetype represent in terms of what it does for the narrative, and then sort of using those as kind of like little reminders as we're developing a story world or characters, and allowing those to kind of guide the process.
Yeah. And kind of what would be an example from your work? Like, how have you taken some folklore and made it your own, or from another example? I don't know. You can use whatever example you want, but if how has folklore been used in a video game or something like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's not, look, folklore has been kind of picked at and dabbled with by games for a long time, but typically they tend to stick in a very narrow avenue. You've got like your Greek mythology, you've got your Viking stories, you've got occasionally some sort of Japanese folklore or ancient Egypt, but we don't normally, like, the games tend to like not veer too far from that, and so there's not a huge amount out there that I can point to currently that is utilizing folklore in the way that I'm exploring it in my own work. But let me think. I mean, I can sort of talk a bit about the specifics of my work if that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so what I've been basically designing, and I've been doing this as part of a PhD thesis here in Auckland as well, and the focus has been on looking at these archetypes and stories from kind of like Northern Europe, particularly the Germanic area, because when you're looking at folklore, Germany tends to be a good example of what was common across the entirety of Europe, simply because the sort of German areas and the Scandinavian areas, they were the most resistant to Christian missionaries, right? So their stories have been the least watered down over the years, right? But the focus that I've been pushing on is this idea that you can use these specific concepts from European folklore to kind of like design different elements of your player character, so that the player, when they sort of inhabit that character, are not so much like taking a hold of them or possessing them is the word that I use, but they're cohabitating with that character. So there is a back and forth exchange between that character and the player as they move through the world. And this is done through a few different processes, but the end result hopefully is that players feel intimately connected with that character, and there's kind of a blurring of the lines between them and the world that they are engaging with. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I may have asked the question wrong, so I think it was a great answer. But maybe what are just a couple of those concepts that you're talking about here that are drawn from kind of the Germanic folklore that then help us understand how players are taking control of their characters in a game?
Off the top of my head, right? So some of the elements that I've been playing with are in sort of pagan Europe, pre-Christian Europe, right? There's this concept of the soul that is quite different to sort of how we perceive the idea of the soul today, right? We have been very much influenced by Christianity and by this idea of the one sort of immortal soul of a person that leaves their body when they die or whatever. But in pagan traditions, prior to that becoming popular, there was this belief that the soul was actually split into multiple parts, or there were multiple souls within a person. I believe the names of these were the Filja, the Hammer, and the Huga in the Germanic. And so the Filja was typically classified as kind of like a guardian angel sort of character, a female deity often that would follow a family bloodline and sort of protect and teach that family as they grew through the ages. I believe the Hammer is get the Hammer and the Huga muddled together without my notes, but one of them is essentially what we understand today as being kind of like the doppelganger or the double, the astral double is what it is often referred to in the folklore. And
I think that's the Hammer.
The Hammer, yeah, okay. So the Hammer would basically it was a double of the person, and the Hammer was able to sort of move across great spaces. They can move into other dimensions, even the underworld, the realm of the gods, the realm of the dead, and they were able to sort of interact with these worlds on behalf of the person. Then there's the Huga, and the Huga is kind of like this energy or animating power that resides within the person, and that is the energy that animates the Hammer. You can see they get confused, but yeah. So there's these three different versions of the soul, and then on top of that, you've got things like the doppelganger, and various others, right? And so what I've done is taken these concepts and thought of what do they represent. So the Filja represents this kind of ideal, right? It's a guardian angel that's guiding a character through the world. And so in the work that I do, I tend to try and create this character in the world. It could be a character, it could be a reoccurring situation. There are various different ways you can play it out. But the point of it is that it guides and pulls the player and the protagonist through the story towards what they could become if they overcome the shadow of the protagonist. There's also the doppelganger, or the inverted double, as I like to call it, and this is this idea that there is a character in the world that is not necessarily antagonistic to the protagonist, but forces the protagonist to look inside themselves and confront their own shadow, and this creates conflict. A really good example of that taking place it can be found in the film Casablanca, right? You've got your protagonist who's kind of like this hard-boiled gritty guy who's been hurt in the past and has kind of like built this identity around himself where he is only out for himself. He's a rogue sort of character, right? And then, you know, the woman that broke his heart walks into his gin joint, right? And she's now, I believe, married to a guy who's sort of quite high up in the resistance against the Nazis. And what the protagonist discovers through interacting with these two characters is that the love of his life is still in love with him, right? He could take her back if he wanted to. He could seduce her, woo her, and they could go off and live a life together. But the side effect of that would be the crippling of her husband, who is instrumental in fighting the Nazis. It would potentially let the Nazis rule the world if he engaged in this darker part of himself and took the love of his life back. And so the husband is actually the inverted double or the doppelganger to the protagonist, in that by engaging with the husband, he's forced to confront the fact that he has this selfish internal desire that could destroy everything if he gives into it. And so the story becomes more about him overcoming that and learning to sort of sacrifice himself for the greater good, and which is a much more interesting story than it would be if it was just him versus the husband or him versus the Nazis, right? And so this is something that I've started utilizing in my own work under the concept of the doppelganger. So yeah, that gives you a couple of examples of how it's being used.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. I hadn't really thought of that before. I'd studied Casablanca quite a bit back in the day because I studied film when I went to college and that. So that is really interesting to think of that, and you can see where that does add that extra element, like you were saying, just verses, right? If they were just Rick competing with the husband. Well, okay, that's a story, right? I guess, but him confronting, some of this part of himself and then sacrificing that to some greater good is obviously way better, right? It's just it takes it from maybe like a soap opera kind of plot to to a pinnacle, right?
Yeah, exactly. I like to think that if you made the movie about him and the husband fighting for I think what's her name, Elsa. Yeah. If it was just about them fighting for her, then you've got potentially a rom-com, right?
Yes.
And if it's just about him fighting the Nazis, you've got an action movie. But him fighting himself, then you've got something that's a little bit more complex, a little bit more I guess higher in terms of the emotional stakes.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, your model there that you have been building is way more complex than you have let on. And you have given a presentation about that. I will definitely throw the link to that YouTube video in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is interested in learning more about the Filja and the Hammer and the Hama and how you view that, I can put that link there so they can watch your presentation. Because I find it, when I watched it, I found it fascinating that there were some of these kind of concepts in folklore that almost do kind of represent some of what we are doing when we're playing a video game character or playing a role-playing game character that is outside of ourselves. I thought that was very interesting, that there is kind of almost all these ready-made concepts that I guess are somewhere deep within us or deep within our cultural memory or something, if that exists. Yeah.
It's all very Jungian, isn't it?
Yes. 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 So why don't I've had you on here, and that conversation about Casablanca, I could probably follow up with a million more questions because I find it fascinating. But I will definitely respect your time. So Nick, why don't you kind of fill us in kind of on what you're working on kind of right now, and then where can people find you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. I guess in terms of what I'm working on right now, there are a couple of projects under wraps at the moment that we can't reveal too much about, but there will be some reveals soon. Currently, I am in the development stage of a interactive transmedia perfume business with my partner. So that is definitely something people can find, I believe, currently on Facebook at the moment. And the business name is Thornwood Parfum. Outside of that, there will be some news shortly about an interactive game project that my producer friend and I have been working on with various others. In terms of where people can find me, probably the best place is either my website, which is www.thepunkwriter.com, or Twitter, which is just @thepunkwriter.
All right. And I will be sure, as I mentioned, also in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, I will put those links in there to your website and to your Twitter so people can find you and learn more about what you are up to. Well, Nick, this was a fascinating discussion. Like I said, I could probably keep going, but it was just really... Yeah, it was just really fascinating. I find this whole area of storytelling amazing. I think we're just, pushing the limits of it. I think storytelling is changing and evolving right before our eyes with technology. So, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
No worries. I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks for having me.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Nick today. As I mentioned in the show, you can go to dicegeeks.com, find the show notes for this episode, and you can learn more about Nick and his work, or watch the presentation that he gave about narrative design and folklore. It is available on YouTube. It is fascinating stuff. Usually people who are into role-playing games love digging into story, folklore, mythology. Nick does all of that in that presentation. I highly recommend you check it out. That link and more will be in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. Check it out. All right, guys. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 20 free dungeon maps, a custom character background for 5e, and tons of other stuff. Okay, guys? Lots of other free PDFs I got tucked away in there. Check those things out, okay? dicegeeks.com/free. Do you got it? Also, you will never miss an episode of this show, and each and every Friday you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on here at Dice Geeks. All right, guys, this has been a great show today. I really thank you so much for tuning in and listening to my humble little podcast. It means so much to me. If you want to support the show financially, that would be amazing and mind-blowing. You can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. That would be so cool, guys. But hey, if you can't totally get it, I have books, I have free stuff. Indulge in all of those things, and I will be more than happy. So again, just thank you so much for listening, and until next Wednesday, keep gaming.